power fuels are the missing link of energy transition and climate change. Why did we say so? We recognize that with just the existing tools, without molecules, it for us seems to be almost impossible to really reach climate targets. So we do need to have molecules in what way ever. And we saw all these technologies really rising up, and hydrogen-based technologies are really increasing a lot behind the scenes a few years ago already. So that's why we called it the missing link. And we are pretty sure that without hydrogen and power fuels, it won't work. Whether it will work with hydrogen and power fuels, that's another issue, but we will certainly work on this. After an annual conference just recently and a regional workshop in South Africa, we organized from the Global Alliance Power Fuels, the GAP. Now this is our Australian-based workshop, and that is for very good reasons, I would say. Many countries do have hydrogen strategies by now. Germany has, the European Union, many countries in the European Union, and many other countries all over the world do have it as well. And especially Australia has such a strategy, and a very interesting strategy for all of us. I think it's interesting for partners in Australia because, as I understand it, as we understand it, it's very much export oriented, which of course is easy to understand. It's a huge country, a very high renewable potential. And the German strategy, on the other hand, and also the European strategy, I must say, is pretty much based on imports. So how can we bring these things together? I know that there are a couple of partners from our alliance and also from other organizations and from both countries are already working and planning on some of those projects. There's a huge thing going on between a variety of partners from Germany and Australia, where they are working on a feasibility study. So how could we best get hydrogen from over there to over here? And this will be an exciting study as well, I guess. But for the moment, of course, there is something like a hype, a huge potential we all see already, but there are also some hurdles, some problems, market barriers maybe. Or, well, I mean, we do have to create a pretty new market, a global market, which is not as easy. But we saw it happen when it came to LNG a while ago. Everybody was saying, oh, well, why should we create a new market for LNG? But it happened somehow. And now this new market is even more important. Maybe just one more thought. I know that in Germany, we do see that we need lots of hydrogen and power fuels, but we also see that there might be a major change in the global value chains of all products. This is another exciting study, but this is, of course, for a country like Germany, a pretty dangerous issue, because we're doing fine with the existing global value chains so far. We are an export nation and we don't want to change that too much. But on the other hand, you can't change the world by leaving everything the way it is. So exciting times ahead of us. And well, we have exciting speakers and for today. And the very first speaker will be introduced by my colleague and by the project manager of this Global Alliance of Power Fuels, Kilian Krone. So I'm very happy to have all these over 100 people on board here. I wish us all a very good time here, and thank you for joining us. Kilian, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Andreas, for the introduction, and I think also for a bit of a strategic overview into the topic. Very happy to introduce Ross Garno as a keynote speaker for today's workshop. Ross has been an advisor to the Australian government, I think, on many occasions. And if you research a bit on Ross, on what you've done, then I can see that you've been busy with both the environment and international trade already since a couple of decades. So that links very well together here. You are here a bit also as the chairman of the Energy Transition Hub, which Andreas mentioned earlier on, German-Australian cooperation on energy transition. And we are very happy to hear your thoughts on Australia's Powerfuels ambition, on your expert potentials that you see for green hydrogen, and also the potential for cooperation with European stakeholders that we have represented here today as well. Ross, the floor is yours, and looking forward.
Thank you, Kilian. Hello, Andreas and colleagues. I'm taking this Zoom from the very middle of the northeastern Australian state of Queensland. Above our heads here, we have approximately the world's best solar resource. Underneath our feet, we have approximately the world's richest coal resource. There's been lots of excitement in the last decade about the possibility of developing this coal resource and creating jobs. And while I'm here during COVID, I'm working with people in showing that, that the resource above their heads can do more for employment and development than the resource beneath their feet. When COVID struck, when the plague struck early in the year, I felt a little bit challenged. I knew that Isaac Newton had fled from the plague back to Cambridge University and wrote Principia Mathematica, which invented modern physics during the year of plague, 1665, and William Shakespeare in an earlier plague had disappeared back to Stratford-on-Avon on the Thames, and Avon going into the Thames, and wrote King Lear, Macbeth, and Antony and Cleopatra. So I retreated to Barcaldine, and my little project has been to show that this very rich solar with some adjacent quite good wind resources can give communities in rural and provincial Australia a sustainable future. Australia's in a strange position on the energy transition. Of all the countries on Earth, per capita and relative to the size of the economy, we've got the richest fossil energy resources, the world's biggest exporter of coal, the world's biggest exporter of LNG, but we also have the richest combination of renewable energy resources. And we've had great difficulty over the past dozen years in working our way from the past into the future. A lot of those contradictions are there in contemporary Australian policy. Our Minister for Energy and Environment, Energy and Emissions Reduction is his title, has recently come out with a what's called a low emissions technology roadmap, and it quite sensibly identifies 5 transformational technologies in which Australia can play a very large part in the global movement to a zero emissions economy. Those 5 are soil carbon, renewable energy storage, production of green steel and green aluminium, zero emissions steel and aluminium, carbon capture and storage, and use of hydrogen. But it's a roadmap without a clear destination and no very clear targets, without a policy engine to drive us in one direction or another, and no timetable for getting anywhere in particular. And the general tone of the discussion and other official and also big business discussion in Australia is that Australia has great potential in the new zero emissions technologies, but this is important for the future. In fact, our government has focused very much on making better use of our gas resources, natural gas as the prime focus of recovery strategy. Well, I think the reality is going to blow that apart. That we're going to be disappointed from the contribution that can be made by a new emphasis on investment in gas to recovery from the pandemic recession, we're going to find that the international situation is not strongly supportive of investment in trade in a lot of old areas. The opportunities are actually going to be in the transition to the zero emissions economy. That is the reality. That reality will break through the confusion and discussion of these matters. Big question for Australia is that will that happen quickly, or will it take so long that we languish in economic underperformance for quite a while until we move ahead? We've noticed with interest and admiration how in Europe post-pandemic recovery policies have emphasized very strongly the energy and climate transition. In the US, the pandemic has undermined the Trump presidency, and nothing is certain in democratic life, but it's more likely than not that we'll see the election of a president and a Congress that's more strongly committed to strong action on the climate and energy transition than US governments have ever had before. In Japan and Korea, the developed countries of Northeast Asia, there's very strong commitment to accelerating the transition. And in September, Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, committed China to zero emissions, net emissions by 2060. I know from a lot of interaction with China over a long time that that statement would have come out of long deliberation. It's very unlikely that it won't be delivered, and it will not be surprising if actual developments move ahead of that. So the international environment is strongly supportive of Australia taking advantage of its great opportunity, but we haven't yet properly worked that out. There's a lot of private sector interest in Australia and community interest in making use of our opportunity. You mentioned CWP earlier on. They're involved in very ambitious plans to utilize export opportunity. In the work that I've been doing here in the small town of Barcaldine in the middle of Queensland, we've identified the possibility right now of not in 2030 or 2035, building on the basis of very low cost renewable energy, hydrogen-based industries that are globally competitive with very low hydrogen prices, the sorts of prices that people in government are saying we should aspire to for later in the decade. The business and community and economic interest is very strong in more rapid transition, but we don't have policies that help drive us there. Published a book last November called Superpower, Australia's Low Carbon Opportunity, which discussed at some length how Australia could do very well in the zero emissions world economy of the future. The strengths are principally in two areas. One is the one I've already mentioned, the best combinations of solar and wind resources in the world, in a number of parts of our geography. And the second is relative to population and economic size, unparalleled opportunities for storing carbon in the landscape and generating biomass for industrial use. The larger opportunity is the former one. The second is also very important. I mentioned at the beginning that we have to struggle against a past in which a lot of wealth and a lot of the high community standard of living came from utilization of a rich fossil energy resource. Back in the 20th century, the use of our coal and natural gas resources gave us competitive advantages in a lot of metals processing. We were quite a big exporter for a long time of a lot of metals that use a lot of energy in processing. Of course, the minerals largely produced here. Australia is by far the biggest exporter of iron oxide for producing iron metal, aluminium oxide for aluminium, and a large number of other mineral products. And processing a lot of those products into metals and other products, usually in a semi-processed form, was a very big Australian industry. We lost that competitiveness in the 21st century for a number of reasons that I discussed in that book, which I'll be discussing at greater length in a new book to come out early in the new year called Reset, Restoring Australia After the Pandemic Recession. But one of the reasons we lost that advantage was that it's not very expensive to move fossil energy internationally. Our coal can be exported to Northeast Asia, metallurgical coal. Actually, a lot is exported to Germany, but much more to Northeast Asia, Korea, Japan, China, for steel making. And it's just as cheap, sometimes cheaper to move metallurgical coal to Northeast Asia than to steel-making centres in Australia. And the total transport costs less than 10% of the value of the final product. Natural gas more expensive to move, but we become pretty efficient at that, and it's quite a small proportion of total value. As a result, the advantage we once had in using those energy materials for energy-intensive manufacturing in Australia weakened in the 21st century, and alongside a number of other factors, corroded the competitiveness of those industries. The point I make in the book Superpower is that as the world moves to zero net carbon emissions, Australia will have again a lot of advantages in energy-intensive industries. We will be a large exporter of electricity to the mainland of Asia through Indonesia, through Singapore. We will be a large exporter of processed renewable energy in the form of hydrogen and ammonia and other hydrogen carriers. But these products are not going to be very cheap in the countries of destination. International transport, high voltage DC transmission has a cost that's substantial compared to the cost of the raw electricity. The liquefaction of hydrogen uses an awful lot of the energy, and it's going to be expensive to move it to any international destination. And so for using these sources of energy, renewable energy, in one form or another, for processing of metals and heavy industrial use, the low cost, the economic thing to do will be to do the early stages of processing in Australia. There'll be a lot of niche industries where it's difficult for countries in Eurasia to develop renewable and zero emissions source of energy for themselves, in which energy is not such a high proportion of total costs as to determine competitiveness, where imports from Australia of electricity or hydrogen or hydrogen in other carriers is important. It will be an important trade, but it won't be an important trade supporting highly energy-intensive industrial processes. The economics will favour that in Australia. We should, right now, the economics are supportive of doing a lot of things, both in domestic use of renewable energy for industry, for transport, and for beginning the niche export of electricity and hydrogen. But it will take longer than it should for our natural advantages, our economic advantages, to be reflected in real investment because of the domestic incoherence of policy and the incomplete commitment to the transition. I hope that period of indecision will not be a long one, and in some ways the pure export industries will be affected less because they are not so directly competitive with established fossil forms of energy in the Australian market. And so there's less resistance from old energy interests. But for all of these opportunities in Australia, it's going to be slower than it needs to be. The new international environment after the pandemic, after the pandemic recession, is I think going to be strongly favourable to accelerated movement on the energy and climate transition. That should create circumstances in which Australia moves more quickly and which breaks some of the policy roadblocks. But we'll need help from our friends in Europe and other countries in getting our minds into that space. There are lots of ways in which developments in Europe and the United States in particular could be very important. We've noted the European Union's commitment to accelerated movement to zero emissions and to supporting that movement with border taxes. Very likely, I think, that if there's a Biden administration in the US and the Democrats have control of the Senate, we'll see very similar developments in the United States. That would put a lot of pressure on Australia to do what is in Australia's interest, but which we otherwise might be slower to do. It becomes crucial in that context that we have open international trading arrangements and compatible climate policies that make it a straightforward thing for a business that's competitive, globally competitive in producing materials built on low-cost Australian renewable energy to enter Germany or elsewhere in Europe or the United States or for that matter, China, Korea, and Japan. None of us will have an interest in protectionist approaches. I note Kilian's observation at the beginning that Germany has done very well from the current pattern of global trade, but that is a pattern that imports a lot of energy. But the main benefit that Germany gets from open global trade is as an exporter of sophisticated capital goods and transport vehicles. And in the emerging zero emissions world economy and the zero emissions economy we need to build in Australia, Germany will be the natural source of a lot of sophisticated machines embodying new technologies. And Germany will be richer from embracing global trade in ways that allow it to be a major exporter of advanced and downstream manufacturers while relying rather heavily on imports of of energy itself, but energy-intensive raw materials like aluminium metal, iron metal, made with zero emissions from low-cost Australian renewable energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross, for this excellent keynote. And it's a bit of a pity that you could not hear the applause in such a digital setting. So thank you for that. I noted one bit of a term that you put in here, incoherent domestic policy, and a similar question to that is also in the chat. Someone asking, Scott Ryle asking, what changes in government policy would you like to see? Or maybe I would rephrase the question, if we take the analogy towards the metallurgical industry that you mentioned, how would government policy need to look like to make this more of an opportunity for Australia? If you could just give us a sentence or two on that, because we're a bit short on time, I think that would be much appreciated from the audience.
Well, what I like is not what I'll get. We had a very good carbon pricing policy in place from 2012 to 2014, and then it was abolished. We were due to integrate our carbon pricing arrangement with Europe's on the 1st of July 2014, and our scheme was abolished on the 30th of June 2014. So if we had that, then we could move smoothly now into the large-scale trade in zero emissions goods that we're contemplating. So that's what I'd like, but we're not going to have that soon. Hopefully it will become possible one day soon. And I think that Europe standing firm on principle on questions of trade and climate can help Australia adjust its policies to policies that are in Australia's interest as well as the world's. But what is realistic now? Well, the government's made it clear it will not have support carbon pricing, and this government will not. Governments change and governments change their mind. But it's in the next few years, we're not going to have carbon pricing. And so what policies are second or third best? One critical one is that we get large-scale support for innovation, for the early examples of each of the new industries that they receive strong government support. There's a strong economic case for that. When an entrepreneur or company embarks on something completely new, it carries a lot of costs that everyone else learns from. And so fiscal support for innovation is important. That is possible under this government. And in fact, the government's doing that in recent announcements. So I would endorse that and say that that has to be done on a much larger scale. There's also quite important things that we need to do to remove inefficiencies in our domestic power transmission. That's not going to be essential when you get power industries specifically set up for export, but will be important when we want to use established industrial facilities. Inefficient, high-cost domestic transmission gets in the way of competitiveness.
Thank you, Ross. Now, I think this also monitors what has happened so far, and I'm happy that in the second session we actually also have a representative here of in the first session. So we will be able, with Rupert Maloney, so we will have to be able to address those questions as well. Thank you, Ross. For now, we will move on to the first panel. And let me very quickly get on the virtual floor Andrew Dixon from CWP Renewables. He's a project manager there, also partner of the workshop, just like the Energy Transition Hub. Karl Berninghausen, CEO of Sunfire, a German producer of electrolyzer technology. I will introduce later as well, and Rupert Maloney, Head of Hydrogen Investment from the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. So the man who will is able to give us more details on the strategy that was just mentioned. Now, first, Andrew, would you like to start? I know you have a motivating video that you brought with you as an introduction into the topic. Now, I know that very recently, about 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, there was a workshop by the Australian Embassy in Berlin, already talking a lot about the political perspective on hydrogen exports and the need for international cooperation. I think the next step from that, some of you may have attended that session, some of you may not. The next step would be to really move on and talk about projects. And that's the idea also and the focus of this workshop, and something we would like to go on. So I'm happy to here to have Andrew Dixon with us. They present a very ambitious and I think well-known project. Andrew, the stage is yours.
Great, thank you, Kilian. Hello, everyone. Really great to be with you and great to support this event. So I'll just share my screen. So I'm involved with a project called the Asian Renewable Energy Hub. And you can see in the top left of the screen that it's in the top left of Australia, in the Pilbara, which is on the doorstep of Asia. It's always been an export-oriented project, but our original plan was to export electrons via subsea cables. About 3 years ago, we pivoted to hydrogen and derivatives, and our project has scaled and advanced very considerably since then. I'll try and advance my slides. Here we go. I have a short video to show you, which describes the vision and what we're trying to achieve.
A clean energy revolution is taking place. Wind and solar energy are now cheaper than fossil fuels, and the end of our reliance on coal, oil and gas to power our world and make our products is within reach. The Asian Renewable Energy Hub will be the largest power station on Earth. Spread across 6,500 square kilometres of the Pilbara in Western Australia, the project will generate 26,000 megawatts of renewable energy using wind turbines and solar panels to capture the world-class resources of our excellent coastal desert site. But that's not all. Our ability to generate large volumes of low-cost, clean renewable energy will not only help power mines and industry in the Pilbara, but also unleash the large-scale production of a new industry, green hydrogen. Hydrogen is used to make fertiliser, pharmaceuticals and many of the products we use in our daily life. It can also be used to power cars, trucks, ships and trains. In fact, hydrogen is so useful, it's often referred to as the master molecule. But hydrogen doesn't occur naturally on its own. Currently, it must be extracted from fossil fuels, causing pollution and greenhouse gases. Green hydrogen, on the other hand, is produced using renewable energy and is therefore pollution and emission-free. Our world has abundant hydrogen. Water is 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, and just a fraction of the world's oceans could supply our world and make our products forever. But the process of splitting hydrogen from oxygen takes electricity. And so, if we want green hydrogen, that electricity must come from renewable sources. And now, we can do it. The Asian Renewable Energy Hub will extract hydrogen from seawater using wind and solar power. This green hydrogen will then be combined with nitrogen from the air to create green ammonia, offsetting over 20 million tonnes of CO2 emissions every year. Green ammonia can be stored and transported at a large scale. It will be used to generate electricity for our growing economies, power ships which transport our goods, make fertilisers for our farmers, pharmaceuticals for our doctors, and many other products. The Earth is our home. We're all in this together. Every action we take affects our planet. There is now a pathway to a 100% sustainable future. The Asian Renewable Energy Hub, leading the world's energy transition.
Okay, so that's the glossy. Now getting into some details. So we've been developing this project now for about 6 years. Last year, we did very formative work with a German company, ThyssenKrupp, understanding how we can turn that, our energy, our electrons into chemicals. And that was a really interesting and very involved body of work. And the outcomes were that the best optimum mix for us is 16 gigawatts of wind generation with 10 gigawatts of solar generation powering 14 gigawatts of electrolyzers. If all of that energy goes into hydrogen, that would be about 1.75 million tons per year of green hydrogen. And then if all of that is converted into ammonia, that's almost 10 million tons per year of green ammonia. Our main focus is exporting that energy in chemical form. And obviously we offer our export customers long-term price certainty because the main input cost, the energy cost is essentially free. We have no fuel supply risk because the wind keeps blowing and the sun keeps shining. And of course, absolutely zero carbon risk. And of course, Australia is a very safe place to invest and to source energy from. This shows the infrastructure that we will use. So on the left-hand side, wind and solar at scale, feeding power via overhead cables to a downstream area where we'll desalinate seawater, we'll split the hydrogen from the oxygen, we'll separate nitrogen from the air, and then combine the hydrogen and nitrogen to form ammonia, NH3. That will then be stored onshore in liquid form and pumped via buried pipelines out to sea, where we'll load ships with liquid ammonia to then take to markets globally. So this shows what it looks like in reality. So our site is located about 20 kilometres inland from the ocean. The site is about 80 kilometres by 80 kilometres, about 6,500 square kilometres. The diagonal lines you can see are rows of wind turbines. So over 1,700 very large wind turbines, spaced in rows about 5 kilometres apart. And then the yellow rectangles you can see are solar PV arrays clustered around our around our electrical substations. And the substations raise the voltage to feed the power to the top left of our site, the light blue area, where we turn electrons into chemicals that we then pump out to sea via buried pipelines. And in the top right, you can see our current concept for multiple loading towers or buoys to load ships at sea. So we've learned a thing or two about green ammonia production, which is quite different from brown or blue ammonia production. And the key really is matching a variable upstream, which is wind and solar generation, with a downstream process that is really being used as a steady state process in the past. So we believe that the optimum sites like ours combine wind and solar. Solar alone or wind alone won't cut it. It has to be both. And ideally, it must be windy at night. And that's to achieve a high capacity factor to get the most use out of the infrastructure. It's important to combine wind, solar, and electrolysis in the right proportions. It's important to maximize the dispatchable loads that can be switched on and off as power is available. It's important to use enough hydrogen storage to provide a buffer, but not too much that it's too expensive. And it's possible with large projects to use what we call rocks and pebbles. So a combination of ammonia plants that are very big and small. So it's possible to mix and match the load from the ammonia synthesis based on the input of renewable energy and hydrogen production. We also believe it's really important to have massive scale. So firstly, it's important to have faster global decarbonisation, which at the end of the day is the reason why we're doing this. We need to move beyond on-grid sort of wind and solar projects for electrons to much larger projects to decarbonise deeper and faster. Large projects reduce the variability from the upstream because when clouds or wind gusts passed over a big site, it tends to blend and smooth across a big site effectively. Less variability from upstream means that you can use electrolyzers that have a lower dynamic response, but which are cheaper and last longer and have higher efficiency. So I think in reality, we'll use a combination of different technologies, but our starting assumption is alkaline electrolyzers. Large projects reduce the levelized cost of ammonia and the delivery risks by implementing in multiple phases. In each phase, basically the risk reduces and the cost of ammonia reduces. It increases the flexibility by being able to mix and match between large and small ammonia plants. And also with scale such as we're contemplating, it's possible to actually establish local manufacturing. And we could readily see wind turbine tower, blade and nacelle manufacturing, and also electrolyzer manufacturing, just to meet the demand of our project, and then to enable other projects like ours. Very large scale enables automation and robotics efficiencies on our large site, but also it gives confidence to emerging markets that supply can scale with demand. And that's really important for industries like shipping, which are making very big decisions on where they're going to source their energy and in what form. But then also importantly, large scale enables us to service multiple markets and for sector coupling. So we could readily see delivering power into the mines in the Pilbara, into direct reduction iron making in the Pilbara, and exporting in the form of ammonia to customers globally. That's the end of my slide deck. I'm aware we're short on time, so perhaps I'll stop there and then look forward to your questions soon. Thank you.
Andrew, excellent presentation. Thank you very much. It also, I think, answers a bit part of one of the chat questions, and that was, what's the benefits of scale, and why don't we, or do we see a centralized or decentralized hydrogen and power fuels economy? Now, for the sake of time, let's just go over to the next project and to the next speaker, Karl Berninghausen, CEO of Sunfire, one of the founders of the company. Key product, I would say, is a high temperature electrolysis. But Sunfire is also heavily involved in one of the first and largest European projects for hydrocarbon e-fuels or power fuels in Norway. And I think we're equally curious to see what makes this project a success and what can make it a success, because I think it's one of the most advanced that we currently have on the continent. So Karl, the floor is yours. Looking forward.
Thank you very much. I will share some slides with you and explain a little bit what we do. First of all, Sunfire is, as we said, a high temperature electrolysis company, which means we have a very efficient process to convert renewable energy not only to hydrogen, but also to hydrocarbons or to other forms of hydrogen complex molecules. And we are also right now in the process of acquiring alkaline technology, because we think, as Andrew just said, it's probably either pressurized alkaline or it's high temperature that will make the game. Sunfire will have both, so we are not biased. We would be very happy with any application. We would be happy with the hydrogen society. We would be happy with the fuel power fuel society or ammonia society. All fine. It's a political game, and it's something where very many actors have to collaborate in order to really come to, for example, a hydrogen solution or company or ammonia company. I think the most easiest and obvious way is to replace the renewables or to put renewables into the existing infrastructure, which is, for example, in the case of aviation and shipping, clearly the power fuel on hydrocarbon base. In order to do that, you have to watch basically three factors. One, I think, has been broadly discussed. That's the prerequisite of system change towards either hydrogen economy or pure electric economy or ammonia economy or into power fuel economy. That has been discussed. The second is scalability of the process of the technology. And I think here, of course, we have to develop a supply chain, but that's a matter of economic power and of time, and can be done. But then critical, the availability of electricity. And the electricity usually is available in remote areas. So the key is making renewables transportable. And making them transportable means to make them liquid. That's why the Sunfire mission is we want to make transport renewable, and we want to make renewables transportable. And the last point, which is important for the decision, is economics. And before I show you the project, I will go into one example with transportation fuel and show you that, for example, based on a study from Abonnieren, the efficiency game, which is normally discussed in this economic environment, the efficiency game is really very similar between hydrogen and power fuels if you can use high temperature technology like Sunfire. So there is not really a big difference between the hydrogen version or the hydrogen path and the power fuel paths with respect to efficiency and conversion. But then if you look down at what happens on the economic side, you have to look at the power prices. And that is, if you can go to remote areas where power is very cheap, then you, of course, make a big difference in the economic gain. And the long-haul transport of hydrogen is more expensive and more difficult than of hydrocarbons. And that's why, in the end, it's for very many applications, it's more economical to use power fuels than to use hydrogen. So I just want to make a pledge that we have to look at both. There is good opportunities for hydrogen, but there's also good opportunities for power fuels. And I think the same idea that Andrew just explained with ammonia is the same idea also with electric fuel, because what we do is we take the electrons, put them into something which is easy to transport, and then can be used in existing facilities. Now, in Norway, we see ideal conditions to do all this here. On the left side here, you see from...
Sorry to intervene. I believe we cannot see your slides. I wasn't aware that you were already trying to show them.
Oh, I see. Now, I'm trying to share. Let's see what I can do here.
I think that's now where it becomes really important, because I think a lot of participants are curious about exactly this. Thank you.
Can you see the slides now?
This works perfectly, yes.
Okay. So let me see. What I was explaining before is that somebody is taking my slides. Are you working with my slides right now? Okay, this is okay. Something's always changing here, but whatever. It's what I explained before was using the slide on economics, and this is the Norwegian project here, where we see a combination similar to what we've seen in Australia, and I think the idea can be quite well adapted to other geographies as well. First of all, Australia, like Norway, has brilliant renewable resources. In the case of Norway, it's wind and hydro, while it's in Australia, solar and wind. The combination is important, as Andrew explained, because we need high hours of full load operation to make things economically viable. The second thing is, of course, availability of money and of technology for fuel or the ammonia process, which we have quite well in Norway. You see the first place for our pilot plant is Herøya in the southwestern part of Norway, where we will establish the first facility, and we will use partly hydrogen from carbon from ammonia sources, and partly also from direct air capture, because we want to make also the carbon direct air capture process economically viable for the next installations in greenfields. We see a definite need to also be capable of using all those resources in remote areas where there is no point source of carbon. And that's why we support strongly the combination with the power to liquid and direct air capture. That's why we partner with Fireworks and have an exclusive partnership for Norway, where we want to start. The economics will work in Norway. You can go one deeper. That's somebody is playing with my slides, and I just need the next one, please. Yeah, if you can go one further down. Yes, thank you very much. So we see that right now all the international studies converge on similar assumptions on what's going to happen with power fuels. while we see that advanced biofuels, which are our benchmark, are in the range between €1.20 to €1.80 per liter, we see that powerfuels are coming down and being quite competitive in that domain. And the Norwegian project will be right in the middle. We will be in the money, at least with our second installation, which is the first large volume and economic installation. And being competitive to other renewables is the game, because we have the quota system in Europe, which is probably going to be a worldwide role model where the renewables will compete with each other and not with the fossils. I think that's a very fair and very reasonable assumption. The powerfuels will then be the mass potential, because there's no real limitations in resources, while all kinds of even advanced biofuels, of course, need land and need biomass, which is scarce. The powerfuels, as shown in Australia, have vast resources in terms of renewable energy and also in terms of carbon dioxide and water, which is, of course, also there. I think this is a role model which can be adapted from Norway to other geographies, like, for example, Australia or Canada or others. And we are happy to support it. The technology behind it will be mainly high temperature electrolysis, but of course also in some applications we can use pressurized alkaline. That is depending on the circumstances. So far, I think that's what I wanted to say, and if there's questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Carl, for this excellent overview on the project, and also thanks for sharing the project economics, because this always helps the discussion, and is nothing that you always see in these kind of discussions. I think there will be a little bit of time for questions if we extend for the break, but now let me just move over very quickly to Rupert Maloney. Rupert is the head of hydrogen investment for Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which is an Australian government-owned green bank or fund. They have been having a very strong track record in investing in various clean technologies. And of course, Rupert, we are curious, would you invest in those two projects presented right now? Is this something that you could also support, maybe with the fund? Rupert, looking forward to your hopefully 5 minutes summary of your activities at CFC and what you make of the discussion here today.
Excellent, thanks, Killian. I might just check whether you can hear me okay.
This works very well, thank you.
And can you see my screen?
That also works. You would just need to full screen the PowerPoint.
Perfect, I will. Great, thanks. I'll try and be really brief and leave some time for some questions at the end. But I'll just give a quick overview of CEFC, so Clean Energy Finance Corporation, because there'll be quite a few people on this call who are unaware of us, and then also what we're doing in the hydrogen space. So Clean Energy Finance Corporation was set up about eight or 9 years ago by the federal government in Australia. As you mentioned, it's essentially the green bank in Australia. We were funded with $10 billion in capital. Potentially, we're going to get an additional $1 billion, which is working its way through Parliament at the moment. We have a really unique role in the market here in Australia. We definitely play to lead the market. So we're investing either debt or equity into clean energy projects where the market isn't there yet, and certainly hydrogen is a space that we're looking at to finance some of these early stage projects, which are really not bankable today by the commercial banks. We've got a pretty good proven track record. As I mentioned, over the last 8 years, we made a very strong positive return for the federal government and the Australian taxpayers, investing across renewable energy technologies, low emission technologies, and energy efficiency technologies. They're the three buckets that we really focus on. Another key point as well is that we're independent from the government of the day. So we have an independent board that makes all ultimate investment decisions. And so we have a clear mandate, what we can invest in under an act of Parliament, and we get on and do it. And so we've deployed At the moment, we've got about $6.5 billion out the door of current commitments. Over our history, we've deployed more than that, and it's perpetual capital pool as well. So as some of those investments are paid back over time, we have further capital to invest. So when we look at investments, we really look through a lens, these three lenses. So we certainly look at financial outcomes. We are not a grant giving organisation, so we need to make a positive risk adjusted return, but we have the ability to provide concessionality, and we certainly will be looking to do that in hydrogen investments. So that's providing, for example, concessional debt, which is providing debt at rates lower than market, so cheaper funding than market rates. We look at emission reductions. So as I mentioned before, those three buckets that we look at, and then the market impact, where we see our role is to leverage private sector investment as well. So we encourage other investors to invest alongside us, or we hope any of our investments will leverage those investments over time. So I know that there's some CSIRO people on this call and they're going to present. So I just wanted to quickly paint the picture of where we sit. And this is, so federal government Australia, CSIRO is very much on the R&D end of the spectrum, the National Scientific Agency. They've done a lot of work in the hydrogen space. I'll let them talk to that. But one piece of work is the National Hydrogen Roadmap. There's also ARENA, our sister agency, which is, the best way to think about it is the grant giving organisation. So they will provide grants to projects which are required and help fund feasibility studies and the like. And then CEFC, which is the bank or concessional finance. We can also invest equity, but the investor. And we work together. There is overlap across the organisations. Certainly CEFC with ARENA. We will go into programs together. So where a project requires grant, the ARENA will provide that, and then when they provide concessional finance, CEFC will look to provide that. So just quickly touching on the Advancing Hydrogen Fund. So this was set up earlier this year when the federal government gave us an updated investment mandate. It's saying essentially $300 million, there's an allocation of capital there within our broader $10 billion fund to really focus in on the hydrogen sector, to invest in the clean, innovative, safe and competitive Australian hydrogen industry. This was a key outcome of the National Hydrogen Strategy, which was handed down late last year, that CEFC would go and support the sector by doing that. And we set up a hydrogen platform, which I'm leading within the business. As this slide says, we can provide debt or equity finance. We'll look at the whole value chain. So it's important to note that we can obviously, our core focus over the years has been that renewable energy. So we can fund any dedicated renewable energy into a hydrogen project. We can fund the electrolyser itself, any associated infrastructure, and then end use applications as well. That's also within our mandate. So for example, if there's a green ammonia facility or a hydrogen truck, a mining truck, we can certainly look to help and finance those assets along the value chain. Where, as outlined here in eligible projects, where a focus certainly is export for us, as well as domestic use. So any large scale, any export facilities or projects that are looking at export, we can fund those or help finance some of those projects. So that includes the hydrogen production and then the infrastructure to finance that export. So we will be in discussions when those projects are at that financing stage. We certainly will welcome those discussions and see where we can use our finance to help any of those projects. So I'll leave it at that. I wanted to keep it really high level, a bit of an overview on CEFC and what we're looking at. Just before I finish off, which I missed here, is our near-term focus, which is quite important because it links into what's happening in Australia. So ARENA is out in the market at the moment doing a $70 million grant funding round for hydrogen. So they've shortlisted 7 projects around Australia, which are sort of at that 10 megawatt plus size. So what we're calling large scale at this point in the market, or this point in the cycle, sorry. But but obviously large scale means different things to different projects. We'll be looking to provide finance to those projects as well. And so we're in discussions with a number of those projects, but we're not limited to that round. We can provide finance to any projects, any hydrogen projects here in Australia, which are commercial. So I might finish up on that.
Thank you, Rupert, for this excellent presentation and overview. The question that in many discussion emerges on projects is, do we need CapEx funding? Do we need equity or debt going into projects, or do we need offtake or offtake agreements that are essentially bankable to some degree? Rupert, is this a discussion in Australia? And then I would also like Carl and Andrew maybe to quickly comment on that. How can projects secure offtake agreements, and maybe also how has the environment been changing in the last year or two from sort of private sector demand?
Yeah, so it's certainly a key discussion here in Australia. It's a key focus of ours. I did skip over that because I didn't want to get into too much of the detail, but certainly from a funding perspective, whether we are debt or equity, we will be pretty focused on that offtake, and that is the key challenge for this industry. Putting in a debt instrument, you need to have that fully contracted offtake. We don't see a vibrant sort of merchant market or a liquid merchant market for some time. And that's the difficult part, because as we look back at renewable energy and when we were financing solar and wind in the early days, CEFC had a big role in that. We got comfortable over a period of time to take that merchant risk because there was an end market, obviously, that electricity was being sold into, and we just had to get comfortable with that spot price risk. It's more difficult in hydrogen, but I think as the market develops over time, there will be opportunities, certainly from a hub perspective, and that's a big focus here in Australia, is to develop these hydrogen hubs where you have multiple offtake at one location, which in time will turn into an export location. And that's why quite a bit of the focus is choosing those locations today, which will enable export over time. So good port access, etc., good location. And then you can have multiple offtake. And I think in time, as those hubs are developed, that will make it easier from a financing perspective, because you'll get more comfortable with some of that merchant offtake.
Thanks, Rupert. Carl, would you like to comment on that also with the experiences of Norsk e-fuel and what can maybe be done also to aid further projects?
Yeah, I mean, with the Norsk e-fuel, we are taking also a different role, maybe closer to the investment perspective, because we are not only development and the producer of technology, but we are their solution provider and investor in the projects, and that's why we are looking for the same criteria. The multiple offtake opportunities are important for us, and also the transportability, which means flexibility with respect to locations and to resources used, which of course will reduce the risk-weighted total cost of ownership from the projects. And there we have two sweet spots. One is the conversion to liquid hydrocarbons, which are multinational salt product, and which are absolutely necessary for example, international aviation, transportation, also shipping in the end. That's where we see a good economic perspective. And then there's industrial uses, which are, of course, then more local combinations between creation of the product and use of the product. Steel industry is important, but also, of course, ammonia and fertilizer industries. And refineries are also using a lot of hydrogen, which could be produced in their proximity. So that's the two sweet spot. It's industrial use, where we have the production of the product close by, and that's transportation fuels, where we need to focus on something which is all over the world well paid.
Thank you, Carl. Andrew, also from your perspective, we know, especially related to your project, that there is this buzz about the project with NEOM in Saudi Arabia and Air Products, which has moved in as a single large off-taker and now making that project viable, according to what we read in the media. How is this looking for you? Are you, let's say, closer to that? Is this also something that you take as a sort of multi-step approach within this very broad projects? Do you pool several off-takers? What's your strategy on that?
Yeah, so firstly, we're happy with the NEOM project. It's a competitor, but it validates the vision that we've had for a number of years. I think we can look to history, particularly with the LNG industry. Obviously, the projects can start supplying local demand and then proceed to exporting on the basis of long-term offtakes. I think that's the way it will go for us. But clearly markets like Japan are looking for significant support and investment from the Australian government that may be matched by support from the Japanese government. So yeah, I think we can look to the LNG industry as a model for us to follow as we look to export new products with low or zero carbon ammonia.
Thanks, Andrew. Also, thanks for highlighting the not only Australian, European, but also Asian dimension. I know we have some representative from Japanese companies also in the call, or in the meeting today. I think it's very important to keep that in mind, also with the strategic importance towards to Australia in the last decades even. Thank you to the three speakers for the first session. For the sake of time, we are already over time. We've already exhausted our break. If you would like to take a break, that's all right. But I think we will just move on with the next panel. Thank you to the speakers. On the second panel, we will look at barriers and potentials. And in a way, we were just already there in the discussion on what brings us to make these visions that Ross outlined and the projects that have been a part of the first session into reality in the future. We will also discuss a bit on fuel types. There was some questions in the chat on ammonia versus hydrocarbons. We've seen that in the projects. We've also discussed shipping, something that Ross mentioned, where transport costs play a larger role. There's analogy to LNG, also the large energy losses that are associated with hydrogen liquefaction. And a discussion that I think increasingly becomes important as a cooperation also between the Asian, Australian and European markets is the question of how can we certify and guarantee the renewability of the products that we procure and that we produce. On the first panel, Sam Bruce, Associate Director of CSIRO Futures, Dr. Falko Uckert, Senior Scientist from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Research, and Karan Bagga, Chief Engineer, ThyssenKrupp Green Hydrogen and Chemicals. Looking forward to the discussion. First on Sam Bruce. Sam has recently completed a research report on renewable, green hydrogen-based aviation fuels, and looking forward, Sam, to your presentation.
Thanks, Julian. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you well. And then one last reminder, please try to keep it short so we can have time for discussion and questions.
Sure, thanks. Waiting for the slides to come up. But yeah, thanks very much for allowing me, or give me the opportunity to speak. Just to start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Hans, I'm not sure if slides.
We can't see them yet. They're coming up right now.
Cool, great, thank you. So I guess taking a slightly different approach, I guess our focus in Powerfuels really stems from some recent work that we've completed with Boeing, looking at opportunities for hydrogen within the commercial aviation sector. So just before getting to, I guess, some of the challenges around ramping up Powerfuels, I'll just give a bit of context in relation to the report. Next slide, thanks. So when we looked at the potential opportunities for hydrogen within commercial aviation, we basically broke them down into three primary technology categories. So we started by looking on airport and basically displacement or replacement of ground support equipment that currently run off diesel and gasoline with hydrogen fuel cell equivalents. And that was really sort of the low hanging fruit by which you can galvanize hydrogen into the sector. and really the early stage opportunity. We then transitioned on platform, so on aircraft, and essentially divided those opportunities into two categories. There's what you can do with existing infrastructure, which is really the power fuel story, particularly with limited uptake of biofuels to date. And we see that sort of becoming a real opportunity in the 2030s. And then we looked at emerging infrastructure. So that the story there is really about the opportunity for cryogenic hydrogen and combustion of hydrogen to power jet engines. And importantly, as you look at this kind of staggered phase scale up, there's really this implicit time component that reflects the maturity of each of the different categories of technology. Next slide, thanks. Yeah, so I guess when we look at the power fuels opportunity, that's really the medium-term opportunity, and the reason being, the reason being, when you look at the aviation sector, there's a really low rate of asset turnover, and so if you look at the primary ways in which hydrogen can be used to achieve meaningful decarbonisation before 2050 without extensive changes in infrastructure, that's really the power fuels opportunity. And through this analysis, so we looked at all the different technologies available, so the different types of CO2 capture from point source industrial emissions as well as direct air capture. And importantly, we looked at both low temperature and high temperature electrolysis, just because every project will have different needs and requirements. And we definitely acknowledge the need for solid oxide electrolyzers down the track, just because of the ability to reutilize that waste heat downstream. But PEM and alkaline electrolyzers are definitely a nearer term, more mature technology to date. Next slide, please. And so I guess when we look at the power to fuel sector, particularly within the context of aviation, we see that there's no real end-to-end commercial jet fuel synthesis, but we really have that's been demonstrated to date, but we really have a strong technology and regulatory base that can be built upon. Particularly, we looked at both fuel synthesis pathways, both Fischer-Tropsch and methanol. And, when we look at the regulations, the ASTM standards within aviation, we see that there's already a precedent for using Fischer-Tropsch to produce drop-in jet fuel or power to fuels or kerosene alternatives. And those blends have been approved up to 50% by volume. Methanol we see as a more favourable synthesis method down the track because of it's a more targeted process and there's less feedstock required, but to date we haven't seen any movement in terms of certification. Next slide, thanks. So in terms of ramping up the power to fuels or electro fuels industry, scale is absolutely critical. It's a general theme that underpins the hydrogen industry more broadly. And probably the most efficient way to try and get that scale in a coordinated manner is by imposing blending quotas. We've seen these sorts of schemes, which have sort of lower transaction costs than an emissions trading scheme, be quite important and quite successful when you look at the biofuels industry in Brazil, for example. And it's really important that we have that phase scale up that's commensurate with industry resources and capacity. It's determined by key advisory bodies like IATA, who are responsible for a lot of the industry advice and standards. And also it's really important that we have this consistency across jurisdictions to make sure there's no market distortions between different countries. Next slide, thanks. So as part of the report, we model, I guess, both a base case and a best case scenario. And we see that with the investment priorities that we set out in the report, you can eventually get to a point at which, electrofuels or power fuels reach about 1.25 to 2.5 times the cost of projected kerosene. That's the pre-COVID projected cost of kerosene once you achieve a 50% blend. Our best case also includes developments in direct air capture of CO2 because of the flexibility it gives in terms of positioning your power to fuels plants, and also importantly the use of solid oxide electrolysis. But blending at this rate is only likely to occur after 2040, and given these lead times, there's definitely a lot of effort required on the part of industry and government to limit that cost pass-through from high cost fuels because it's such a material operating cost for airlines. Cool, I think that's it. So I'll stop there and pass on to the next speaker.
Sam, thank you. I think a very good summary on sort of also the challenges of aviation as a lead offtake market, which I think is something very prominent in the discussions, in the sort of overarching climate discussions, but at the same time, the economics remain a bit challenging. Now, there will be some time for questions after everyone presented, and so encourage you to use the chat also to let your questions be heard. Next up is Dr. Falco Oeckert from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Research. He's a postdoctoral researcher there, and will shed some light on a modeling study that he's recently done. He works rather internationally with, I think, modeling teams all over the world. The lead question is already there. Falco, floor is yours.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, I want to zoom out a little and also have a look at the economics, at the short-term and long-term economics of hydrogen and power fuels. And the session title is Potential and Barriers of Hydrogen. So to illustrate the potential, I pose a question here. Can green hydrogen actually become cheaper than electricity? And this, of course, sounds like a paradox, but in a minute I show you that it is actually possible. We saw costs before, costs of power fuels in Mr. Berninghausen's presentation, and we just saw also the cost competitiveness of aviation fuels. What I show here are levelized costs of hydrogen based on different methods. All are relying on a literature review of CapEx and efficiencies, and you can see that the cost reduction potential is immense. And you can simply calculate ICOH, and the most difficult part of it is, of course, what are the electricity costs behind it. And here we do one advancement that we base on our modeling, and the modeling is done by a bilateral group of Australian and German researchers, and we run several models for Australia. And you see in the lowest cost bar, I don't know if you can see my mouse, if in the lowest cost bar, this is actually a 200% renewable scenario where hydrogen electrolysis is integrated into the power system. And here we actually see that levelized costs of hydrogen can be lower than electricity costs. And here I need to be accurate. They are lower than average electricity costs in such a system, because they benefit very much from low price hours. And in a renewable heavy system, you have many low price hours, and you have a skewed price distribution. And here LCOH can become really cheap. I'm not saying that in remote off-grid projects like the Asian Renewable Energy Hub that we saw earlier, that they cannot become cheap. They have the huge benefit of course, going to the best wind and solar sites. And I think we see a future where we have both. Actually, if you look at today's system, you can, the first two bars are actually LCOH for Australia today. One is based on NEM prices, so the National Electricity Market, and the second one is based on South Australian prices already. And here you see, even though the average price in South Australia, the electricity price is higher than those across the NEM, you have lower electricity costs for the electrolysis. And you can see that nicely in the price duration curves that I showed here on the right side. And actually, what I did here, I cut off the negative prices because with scaling hydrogen, those negative prices will disappear, which is a benefit to the system. But if you even consider the negative prices, then you see that dot dropping by quite a bit. So how do these costs compare to fossil fuel costs? Here you can compare it with fossil hydrogen, with gasoline, and with natural gas. And you actually see that, that they get into the range or get even below the costs of those fossil counterparts. the competition with natural gas is very challenging. The one with liquids is better, but of course you need some additional costs here, for instance, for a fuel cell that I did not incorporate here. One word on carbon prices. I'm not trying to convince Australia to introduce a carbon price scheme today, because I'm saying we have one in the EU, and with the accelerated targets, those prices in the EU ETS for industry and electricity will steeply increase, and also for the non-ETS sector, so for buildings and transport, we will have at least implicit carbon pricing. In Germany, we have an explicit one already, and carbon prices will likely rise very much into 3-digit numbers. And here you see carbon prices, and you see that in the short term, of course, those carbon prices are much higher than those that we have in the system. But already in 2030, liquids and fossil hydrogen with carbon pricing that I anticipate higher than those of those costs of hydrogen. These are EU ETS prices. Last graph. The blue lines here are carbon prices from scenario modeling in 1.5 to 2 degree scenarios, and the decreasing lines are costs of hydrogen and e-fuels. Actually, the required CO2 prices behind them, and you see the short-term barrier is really this one. How can we, without carbon pricing, really bridge that gap? And of course, the answer is we have to scale up the economy to go down the learning curves. But how do we scale up those? With policy instruments, we need subsidies. That's very, very obvious. And the main part of it could be the ambition of EU and Germany. And the policies, the climate and energy policies there, for instance, carbon contract for differences, they could create a demand pool that then Australia could follow. And hereby that would also change the economics for hydrogen in Australia. And maybe the last word, the concepts around carbon contract for differences, which is a guaranteed carbon price for hydrogen demand in industry, are very much prioritizing those sectors where there's no direct electrification alternative, which makes absolute sense if you see those high costs that we have in the next 10, maybe 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Falco. I think that was an excellent presentation with a provocative title, but also shows that there's hope and maybe there's more opportunity than we thought earlier on, and that seems to be a recurring theme, some optimism for today's event. Also thinking about Karl's presentation that he showed earlier. Now I'm leading over to the next speaker. Next speaker is Karan Bagga, Chief Engineer at ThyssenKrupp Green Hydrogen and Chemicals. He's the head of all things green hydrogen and green chemicals from the technology side in Australia for ThyssenKrupp, and responsible for furthering and the implementation of the technologies, the various, I think, in-house that touch at sort of the chemical side, that is ammonia, methanol, synthetic natural gas even. Karan, your thoughts on potentials and barriers, maybe also linking to the discussion earlier on for project development, what kind of projects are you looking at and what's holding them back? The stage is yours, or the floor is yours.
Thank you, Killian. Thanks for a very warm introduction and the opportunity to present to the esteemed audience. Let me quickly share my screen. Hopefully it works. Can you confirm that works?
Yes, it works. We can hear you well.
Excellent, fantastic. All right. Okay, well, leading on from your last statement in the intro itself, I think, my slides I'll talk about today, just the potential in Australia, what type of fuel and whereabouts, and possibly also touch on the potential barriers that we see in the way, and what we at ThysGroup are doing to perhaps overcome some of those. But the first slides that you have on the screen essentially shows the landscape of Australia, and I think a lot of things become very obvious and clear when you look at these couple of maps that I've put on. On the left, you will see the PV potential, or the essentially the renewable energy intensity of the from PV in Australia. You can see that it's dominated, or rather concentrated, in the northwest region, and that's where Andrew's project is, the Asian Renewable Energy Hub. It's about here. And on the right, you see the suitability of the infrastructure around Australia, which is quite I would say limited to around the coast, as you would expect, because that's where the bulk of the population lives, and that's where the industrial sectors are. And why I wanted to show this is because this determines, this is perhaps the root of the lowest resistance pathway to the type of fuels which we think Australia will produce economically and quite competitively in the world stage. So we think obviously the carbon-free power fuels such as hydrogen and ammonia dominate, and you will see the bulk of the projects in Australia focusing around that. But also there is a lot of potential for carbon-based fuels such as methanol as well in certain areas such as Tasmania. Whilst there are a number of projects being developed around the coastal location in the northwest or the northeast, which are ammonia and hydrogen-based, Able Energy, which is one of the proponents for green methanol project, is located down here in Tasmania, which is abundant biomass, for example. So these sort of things would matter ultimately at where these projects are located and at what sort of scale they become available. Next, I'll just take a look at the industrial CCU, or the biogenic carbon-based methanol, for example, is one of the front runners, which we believe that Australia will look to produce in future. Australian methanol market is not that big, and so bulk of our methanol comes from overseas. A couple of the plants, or rather one of the plants that was down here was conventional, which had been shut down. But essentially, stepping into a power fuels global market, the potential for large-scale green renewable energy, possibly in locations such as Tasmania, which is hydropowered, and also coexistence of biomass there, makes green methanol quite a good possibility. And the good thing with green methanol is the premium market already exists. So perhaps it's not at the volumes that we are talking about, but there is a seed of that, ability to pay, or rather need to pay the green premium, which perhaps doesn't exist for synthetic natural gas or possibly even ammonia at this point. Similarly, for moving on to carbon-free fuels, which is hydrogen and ammonia, has been talked about a lot in the past by the past speakers just recently. Again, that's obviously the dominant pathway there. We believe that when we look at exports to Europe, the distance obviously is tyrannical, and there will be penalties associated with it. But the cost of transport to far-fetched locations for products such as green ammonia is not that big in context of the overall cost. So whilst the competitiveness is much better for exporting it to the Asia Pacific regions such as Japan and Korea, the overall economics for exporting to Europe could be helped by policies or funding supports, in an international sort of a trade mechanism between the two countries, such as Germany and Australia. But green ammonia also provides, a fantastic decoupler from the fossil fuel economy. So it's less sensitive to the ups and downs and the vagaries of the fossil fuel-based economies. So provides a longer-term assurance in that sense. So does the green methanol in that respect. Now, what we are doing in Australia as ThysGroup, so again, because as you mentioned previously, Killian, that the hydrogen, I guess Australia prides itself as being an exporter of the energy. And as such, the focus has been on developing large-scale projects. So as a result, we have developed based on our technologies, larger scale concepts for both ammonia as well as methanol, which we believe are fit for Australian landscape. And ultimately, that scale brings about the benefit of reducing the cost, no doubt. One of the projects that I would like to talk about then in Germany is as an example of where carbon-based fuels such as methanol, and this is industrial CCU, is we're looking forward to develop this with our partners, is the Westküste 100 in Heide in Germany. That's the refinery. And whereby the CO2, essentially looking to capture CO2 from the nearby cement plant and then convert that into methanol as a drop-in fuel in the existing refinery, or convert it further to olefins as for blending with jet kerosene, etc. But ultimately, we live in a carbon society. We can't avoid it. I think all this talk about decarbonization forgets one point, which is that we cannot live without carbon. It's the form of carbon that matters. And I think keeping that in mind, with respect to how we handle that carbon, how we price that carbon, and what definition we use is quite an important factor. And this is what I believe is needed to bring some of the very high potential fuels to equal par with carbon-free fuels, such as methanol. And to that end, I look forward to the discussions in the next 5 or 4 minutes. So hopefully we can talk a bit more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Karan. Excellent presentation. Also, I think full of content and numbers, which then our participants can look at after. I think that will be very useful for the discussion. Now, maybe on the question of which fuels, there seems to be a consensus that carbon-free is better than with carbon, or less complicated maybe, or easier to produce. I think that is straightforward. At the same time, from the demand side, there currently may be a bit more demand for hydrocarbons than for green ammonia, or willingness to pay the premium. In some parts of the discussion, and I know in the discussion with Japan, hydrogen liquefaction and also liquid organic hydrogen carriers still play a role. And I think the downsides are also well known. That is conversion losses, especially for liquefaction, the necessity to bring back the hydrogen carrier once it's been, so to speak, emptied. Both these technologies, however, I think featured very strongly in the discussion lately as well. Karen, what would be your assessment? Is this something that you're looking at ThyssenKrupp as well? Something that could be a potential also for the European Australian Corporation, or something that only is of interest currently to Eastern Asian stakeholders?
I think the European Australian context to the whole export economy is a recent, I would say, very welcome development, no doubt. It's what form of export we take to ultimately, let's say, allow European nations to benefit from the potential that Australia has. So whether it be direct export of power fuels, such as ammonia, again, but there may be preference to get it from nearby sources, but keeping in mind that Australia presents some other benefits as well, such as security, such as a very stable climate, and essentially potential for longer term contracts. And also keeping in mind that the renewable potential is very large scale, which ultimately suits the export industry. So these things keeping in mind, I'm quite excited to see how the space pans out. I think we need a bit more collaborative work to raise awareness both ends. That's something which doesn't exist today. Is not necessarily a far-fetched dream. We at least ought to try to make it happen. And if it doesn't happen because of physics reasons or economic reasons, then so be it. At least we know that. We draw the lines.
Thanks, Karen. Falco, would you like to comment on that also from your perspective of sort of fuel choice, because you already had several fuels as part of your analysis?
Yeah, I can. I'm looking from a systems perspective, and I can only say that the question of carrier very much depends on the long-term vision where we want to end up. I mean, it's fine to have entry points, of course, and there we have a competition of different carriers, and that's a phase where we are at to learn and bring down costs. But in the end, the long-term vision determines the infrastructure that we need. And the infrastructure that we need can be very, very different depending on how we want to use hydrogen in the end. Is it direct use in Germany for steel and ammonia, then we need to import hydrogen, or at least maybe with some carrier, but we need to strip it off later. And we cannot do DUC in the deserts or in Australia where energy costs are low. And also the question of blue hydrogen as a bridge, because I anticipate that green hydrogen will be very scarce, at least compared to the targets that we are having, also poses the question of, can that really be a bridge? What is the overlap in infrastructure that we have? We shouldn't build a blue hydrogen infrastructure and then tore it down and move to green hydrogen instead. So yeah, difficult. So in the end, it boils down to the role of hydrogen on the demand side. Where do we want to use it? And maybe last point, do we still want to manufacture steel in Germany, where it's very, very clear that in a low carbon world, the advantages are with those countries where renewables are and the costs are low.
Thanks, Marco. I mean, that also, I think, links well even to Ross's point in his keynote and asking the question, so where do we need manufacturing to be, especially for industries that can be moved rather easily? Now, Sam, I would like to extend that question to you also as CSIO, as an organization fostering technology development. Where would you see Australia's role in the supply chain or also in the technology supply chain for the whole power fuels and hydrogen industry? And then also coupled with the second and last question regarding your slides again, as you showed the potential, more the technological and economic potential for green aviation fuels, is this something where you see, let's say, Australian Airlines, Qantas going on board with, or is this something driven more, let's say, abroad from other countries?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the current climate, it's, I guess, we can't put too higher expectations on the airlines, first and foremost, given a lot of their challenges at the moment. But yeah, I mean, I think with the aviation sector, just to answer the second question, you know, in ordinary times, these businesses run on very thin margins, and so, you know, fuel costs, you know, can contribute up to 30% of an airline's operating costs, and you know, so a higher cost fuel creates considerable challenges, and you know, the nature of the industry is also to pass through those costs to the consumer. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done by all stakeholders involved, you know, on the oil and gas side, you know, governments. Yeah, it's going to require a massive coordinated effort. I think on the export of hydrogen, you know, that's probably the one area when you look at the hydrogen value chains. I think that's still, you know, getting low cost, high volumetric density carriers is still one area where there's a lot of R&D required. I think, you know, in a lot of other applications for hydrogen, we're largely talking about mature technology, and the question is more about market activation. But as was mentioned by Falco earlier, you know, it depends on the end use, and each sort of carrier has different benefits and disadvantages as well. So, you know, ammonia is an important one, but, you know, you have that challenge at the point of use where, you know, if you want to use hydrogen again, you have to sort of extract high purity hydrogen, and Syra has done a lot of work in developing, you know, those high purity membranes to facilitate that. But yeah, completely agree that it's end use dependent, and particularly for the aviation sector, it's one of the powder fuels are one of the few ways that they can sort of achieve some ambitious decarbonisation targets, you know, in the next couple of decades. So yeah, hopefully we can play a role in facilitating that development too.
Thank you, Sam. No, I think that's also an important part is this sort of value, not this value chain, but this transition as shown earlier, I think also by Rupert, where very different stakeholders ought to play a role in accelerating this transition. Let me say thank you to the first panel. I think there would have been space for another hour of this very interesting discussion and exchange, and I think unfortunately we have to move that to the bilateral exchange afterwards, and just encouraging all the speakers, but also the participants to get in touch with each other afterwards. Normally we would have this as a physical event, and you would now sit at a coffee break and be able to, you know, informally chat. So please do that. I think the emails were included in the presentations, and we will be able to share the presentations afterwards with you. So just make sure to get in touch. Now, I think we get to a new part and also a new format of the workshop, and that will be the breakout sessions. We've never properly tried this to have larger, rather small groups of participants joining in on specific questions. However, we will try this today. I see most of you have renamed yourself to attend certain sessions. We will couple this with about 5 minutes of break, sorry, 3 minutes of break. My administrative colleagues tell me right now, so that you can grab a cup of coffee, and then we start with the breakout sessions in 3 minutes. The idea is really to get into informal discussion with other stakeholders on more specific questions, and we will allocate you in the respective breakout rooms. Thank you so far. We will see you again at the wrap-up after the breakout sessions, and please stay in the Zoom meeting. We will just allocate you into the breakout sessions. Looking forward. So good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody, and welcome back to the main room of our digital conference here. I see that we have several more videos ongoing of people sharing their videos than before, so this speaks for a lively discussion that we have. Now, as we had so many parallel sessions, I think there is almost no possibility of summing up these discussions in a minute or two. And that's why we will try to collect all these discussions later on in a very short summary that we will make available to you as well. Maybe as a summarizing remark from our side, I think for us it's been a very productive workshop, both on new input parameters for economics of power fuels. We've seen that both from the supply side and from the demand side, it seems that we are approaching commercialization of these technologies, not only for local users, but maybe also for international users. We've also seen that while we have a lot of ambitions about projects and that we see first offtake agreements emerging, we might even get into something like a merchant market for green power fuels in the future, where Australia and Europe and also other regions could play a role. If it goes according to the European Commission, we know they wrote in their European hydrogen strategy that Europe should be the leading quote currency for green hydrogen products, and that is always something that's hotly debated on European panels these weeks, whether that's a realistic statement or not, but it's certainly something to consider. It may be the Australian dollar, but what it shows, I think, what's behind that statement is that we need some sort of common understanding of which kind of products we want, in which time scales can we afford them, and that we in the long run may indeed move towards a market, but first have to create viable products in the meantime and viable projects. We've seen a couple of those today, and I'm very happy that we had such a productive and I think also easygoing exchange with more than 100 people in the beginning and more than 70 remaining now for the breakout sessions. I'll thank you all for participating today. I will also let you know that in the Global Alliance Powerfuels, we are working with about more than 30 stakeholders actually on a variety of these issues that concern international trade and certification and project development for green hydrogen products. And we will have other events coming up soon, other reports also being written. If you're interested in collaboration, just strongly encourage you to get in touch and hope to see you soon. Stay safe, and thanks for joining today for the workshop. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Good one.
Thank you. Great discussion. Bye.